You will have noticed by now, if you are still listening to this presentation, that some of the perspectives on the nature of the human being, of animals, and of evolution are different from the ones you're used to hearing. You have heard some familiar terms such as natural selection, adaptation, and specialization used in reference to animals, but how these concepts are being related to human beings is probably puzzling and maybe even concerning to you. This I understand. At the same time, I am hoping that you have noticed that I've made a great effort to present actual morphological and physiological phenomena related to the topic of human and animal growth, as far as I have been able to understand them. The reasons that you may not have heard these scientific facts brought together in the way that Jos Verhulst has done and that I have tried to represent are probably very complex. But the history of science shows us that long-held and firmly held theories are not easily let go of by the professors and other professionals when their careers and prestige are put into question. The serious work of biologists, embryologists, and evolutionary theorists in Europe over the past century has been greatly ignored by much of the English and American scientific community. Perhaps the wars, or perhaps the language barrier played a part in this shutting out of so much good and relevant work. But whatever the reason, it has set back progress in this field immeasurably. Stephan Jay Gould, one of the most famous and well-respected paleontologists and evolutionary theorists of the last 50 years, recognized this disconnect and addressed it, even if only briefly, in his essay entitled Another and Unfairly Maligned Approach to Evolution. I would now like to make available to you at least part of that essay so that you can hear Gould's recognition of the good work that has been done and is being done, and hear his recommendation that we be open-minded to what he calls a pluralistic view in this important scientific field. He opens his essay with these words. In continental Europe, evolutionists have never been much attracted to the Anglo-American penchant for atomizing organisms into parts and trying to explain each as a direct adaptation. Their general alternative exists in both a strong and a weak form. In the strong form, as advocated by such major theorists as Schwindewolf, Romain, and Grasse, natural selection under the adaptationist program can explain superficial modifications of the bow plan that fit structure to environment, why moles are blind, giraffes have long necks, ducks webbed feet, for example. But the important steps of evolution, the construction of the bow plan itself, and the transition between bow plana must involve some other unknown and perhaps internal mechanism. We believe that English biologists have been right in rejecting this strong form as close to an appeal to mysticism. But the argument has a weaker and paradoxically powerful form that has not been appreciated. It deserves to be. It also acknowledges conventional selection and superficial modifications of the bowel plan. It also denies that adaptationist program, atomizing plus optimizing selection on parts, can do much to explain bowel plana and the transitions between them. But it does not therefore resort to a fundamentally unknown process. It holds instead that the basic body plans of organisms are so integrated and so replete with constraints upon adaptation that conventional styles of selective arguments can explain little of interest about them. It does not deny that change, when it occurs, may be mediated by natural selection, but it holds that constraints restrict possible paths and modes of change so strongly that the constraints themselves become the more interesting aspect of evolution. Gould continues, Rudolf Riedel, the Austrian zoologist who has tried to develop this thesis for English audiences, writes, the living world happens to be crowded by universal patterns of organization, which most obviously find no direct explanation through environmental conditions or adaptive radiation, but exist primarily through universal requirements, which can only be expected under the system conditions of complex organization itself. This is not self-evident, for the whole of the huge and profound thought collected in the field of morphology, from Goethe to Romain, has virtually been cut off from modern biology. It is not taught in most American universities. Even the teachers who could teach it have disappeared. Here we should note that Riedel says that those who could teach this profound thought in the field of morphology have disappeared. But we know that this turns out not to be true. Now, even in English, the recent work of many Goetheanists is surfacing and becoming more widely known and potentially opening up a fruitful dialogue. Gould continues his essay, exploring in detail the number of examples that he finds pertinent, and then concludes with what I would like to call an appeal for openness. He writes, we feel the potential rewards of abandoning exclusive focus on the adaptationist program are very great indeed. We do not offer a counsel of despair, as adaptationists have charged, for non-adaptive does not mean non-intelligible. We welcome the richness of that pluralistic approach, so akin to Darwin's spirit, can provide. Under the adaptationist program, the great historic themes of developmental morphology and bowel plan were largely abandoned. Too often, adaptationist programs gave us an evolutionary biology of parts and genes, but not of organisms. It assumed that all transitions could occur step by step and underrated the importance of integrated developmental blocks and pervasive constraints of history and architecture. The pluralistic view could put organisms with all their recalcitrant and intelligible aspects back into evolution. Doesn't that last statement strike you as a bit odd? That it would be good if organisms were put back into evolutionary thinking? How is it that they ever left? For isn't evolution all about organisms? Darwinism focused more on the parts of organisms rather than the whole. And neo-Darwinism's focus has largely become genes to explain the parts. Even the concept of the organism is something that puzzles many scientists. Their reductionist approach seeks to break wholes down into ever smaller parts until in the end the organism is all but lost. The species, for example, is nothing other than a collection of individual animals, a population capable of interbreeding. Only the parts are real, and the whole is just a word. The same is true for the organism. It is thought of as a complex machine composed of many interworking parts, which ultimately must be thought of as being composed of ever smaller parts that are the real determining elements of what stands before us as an animal. This view of organisms is foreign to the Goethean approach, which regards the whole as more than the sum of parts. We hear Goethe's comment on reductionist approach of his time when in his drama Faust, he puts in the mouth of Mephistopheles the following words: "Who would study and describe the living starts by driving the spirit out of the parts. In the palm of his hand he holds all the sections, lacks nothing except the spirit's connection."